Faces tell stories. Joe Sacco was born in Malta in 1960. From there, his family moved to Australia and then on to LA in 1972. In 1981, he received a degree in journalism from the University of Oregon, but he became disillusioned with that discipline and began creating comics in Malta. He returned to Portland and then traveled to the Middle East in 1991 to research Palestine during the First Intifada. Palestine was published by Fantagraphic Books in 9 issues from 1993 to 1995, and then collected as a graphic novel in 2001. Palestine won a 1996 American Book Award. Sacco went on to write Sefer Garajda, one of 4 books on the conflict in Bosnia, and one which won multiple awards. Since then, he's also published Footnotes on Gaza, which won the 2010 Ridenour Book Prize, But I Like It, a collection of early stories reporting on rock and roll, and The Great War. His work has recently been collected in the anthology Journalism. Sacco gives us faces. Faces cover Palestine. Faces crowd its pages. Faces layer upon faces. Each face tells a story of humiliation, of anger, of bias, and of truth. This is a difficult comic. What makes it difficult is that it recognizes a political situation as a personal situation. It recognizes the cost of national security on human beings and puts a face on it. And more, it gives us no tidy solution to the situation. So when we come to Palestine, we come to a powerful work that addresses the media in the sense of journalism. A report of the First Intifada, the Palestinian uprising from 1987 to 1991. This is not the only powerful journalistic or documentary comic. Recently, U.S. Representative John Lewis and Andrew Aydin and Nate Powell have created March, a story of the civil rights movement in America. Palestine is a bravely disturbing, frustratingly one-sided, and tremendously timely comic, one that demands consideration. Witness page 208 of Palestine, the title page to Rewind. The page has a density of text and image that recalls both the work of R. Crumb and, I think somewhat surprisingly, Frank Miller. In this page, Sacco's drawings recall Crumb's. Here's a page from Crumb's later work, his amazing 2009 comic of the Bible, of the chapters of Genesis, and it demonstrates his unmistakable and enduring style, his ability to create depth from blacks and from cross-hatching. The page tells how the water surged over the earth for 150 days, and I exhibit it here because it nicely shows how Crumb is able to give shape to water, making it almost sculptural while maintaining its flow. A quality that Sacco captures in his drawing as well. Sacco's work also recalls Frank Miller's, both Miller's Bigfoot style in The Dark Knight Returns and his work after that book, especially in Sin City, which began in late 1991, the time Sacco was drawing Palestine. Here's Miller's anti-hero, Marv, walking in the rain. Miller boldly separates out his prose into a single column, creating the page as almost an illustrated book. His heavy blacks create the feeling of a woodcut more than simply an inked illustration. He uses negative space, the contrasting space around the figure, to define the figure, so Marv is created as a silhouette, in effect, an empty being. Rewind gives us a similar page layout, creating a density of prose to match the rainstorm. I'm blinking fast, snapping mental pictures and thinking, this'll make a great couple pages in the comic. A weird scene of a pitching car with the rain going torrential while Samas strains to see over his shoulder into the dark and fumbles with the gears to back us out of another washed out path. And that's me next to him. And this is my happiest moment. I've made it, you understand? I've come hundreds of miles via planes and buses and taxis to be precisely here. Jabalia, the must-see refugee camp of the Gaza Strip, the Intifada's ground zero, a Disneyland of refuse and squalor, and here I am brushing up against the Palestinian experience, a goddamn adventure cartoonist who hasn't changed his clothes in days, who stepped over a few dead rats and shivered from the cold, who's bullshitted with the boys and nodded knowingly at their horrible narratives. And I'm pinching myself in a car, in the dark, in a flood, giddy from the ferocity outside, thinking, throw it at me, baby, I can take it! But I've got the window rolled up tight. Sama, on the other hand, is unaware of the moment's magnificence. I don't like this! I don't like this! He's stressing. He hasn't got a license. Also, we've got a forbidden video on board. Rewind. The opening line on blinking fast, snapping mental pictures defines Sacco as a witness to spectacle. He's blinking with nervous excitement, but he's also recording images, his thick glasses like cameras for the comic he will create. And he's giddy with delight, and defines this as his happiest moment. In Jabalia, the Intifada's ground zero, a Disneyland of refuse and squalor. So Sacco presents the experience as his brush up against authenticity. Sama's worried, but Sacco's thinking of the planes, buses, and taxis that brought him and that will presumably take him home again. He's an interloping tourist from the West who can roll up his window from the cold and wet in the end of the day. Sacco is able to rewind his situation. Regardless of the car's wheel spin, he's not stuck. Sacco gives us a name for this role, a goddamn adventure cartoonist, and the name both underscores what he's trying to do. He's trying to use cartoons to create a news documentary and parodies the entire effort, labeling it an adventure, something more than a tourist trip, but still the encapsulated experience of an outsider dipping in. The passage ties together three themes that we have followed through the entire course. First, it shows that comic creation is involved in reflection on comics history and on comics making. That even as Joe Sacco sets out to do something new, he's also aware of and making use of what comics creators have done before him, and thinking about the way the art form works. Second, in this process of reflection, the page is particularly focused on how comics create persona, in this case representing Sacco as part of the media, a narcissistic visitor who is more involved with his own ego than with the story and who has a lot to learn about human experience. It authorizes his telling through parody, framing it as part of a Bigfoot representation. This quality marks Sacco's identity as a journalist. His approach is called New Journalism, a term coined by Tom Wolfe in 1973 and exemplified and perfected by Hunter S. Thompson in The Kentucky Derby is Decadent and Depraved, an essay for Scanlon's Monthly in 1970. New journalism is a mode of reporting that foregrounds the satiric observer in its own report, that recognizes that any documentary is told from a particular perspective and that the subjective telling is much a part of the objective truth. Cartooning, goddamn adventure cartooning, has long held a role in new journalism because in its unreal mode it expresses the realism of satire. Here's the work of Ralph Steadman, Thompson's longtime illustrator, whose drawings capture the decadence and depravity Thompson describes in prose. But for all this parody, Sacco's page is thoughtfully done. Not only do the prose and illustration work together to create density, but the title sums it all up. It sets out the chapter's theme, the delivery of Sama's videotape, which needs to be rewound, and connects to Sacco's eyes snapping pictures in the passenger seat of the car, because cameras too, 35mm cameras at least, need to be rewound as well. Thus the scene brings us to a third point. Rewind is all tied up in thinking about suspended animation, about the particular overlap between comics and photography. Sacco differentiates these two media. Let's rewind the book to page 71. Here, Sacco and the Japanese photojournalist he's teamed with, Saburo, investigate the aftermath of a raid by Israeli settlers. While his trial isn't over, the settler needn't worry unduly about the scales of Israeli justice. From December 87 to October 91, settlers killed 42 Palestinians, and in that time only 3 trials have concluded. The stiffest sentence? 3 years. On the other hand, Palestinians killed 17 settlers during the same time period. 6 of the 9 suspects captured in these incidents received life imprisonment. 1 received 20 years. 6 family homes were demolished. The remaining 2 suspects were still in court. How do you feel about the settlers? What kind of feeling would you have if your door was smashed down? Would it be a feeling of love? You don't feel secure in your own home, your own street. Who do we have to complain to? The soldiers? Before we go, someone hands Saburo a photo of the two dead youths. Saburo doesn't say a thing the whole drive back. In Jerusalem, he says he doesn't want the photo. Too heavy! Too heavy! And after a day like today, sure it's too heavy, even for a vulture like me, but I'll take it. 'Cause faces are what it's all about, man, and I put the faces way in the bottom of my pack. I mean, who's to say they'll be too heavy tomorrow? The Palestinians give Saburo a photo of two dead youths. The pain of that photo, of the image, is too much for Saburo, who says in his broken English, "Too heavy, too heavy." Faces are what it's all about, man, Sacco thinks, and so he takes the photo, labeling himself a vulture for doing so, but nevertheless storing it away for later. He doesn't want to lose the face, the individual, and so he plays with representation, converting photos into Bigfoot comics, but nevertheless capturing human individuality. Witness the intense expressions of the two men in the top tier, the drawn and faraway quality of the old man in the first panel of the second tier. These are Bigfoot drawings, but they are nevertheless moving and powerful. Too heavy, too heavy. Sacco's approach is the same as Art Spiegelman's in Maus. Spiegelman dealt with the heaviness of the Holocaust by converting people into funny animals, which allowed him the emotional distance he needed to tell his story. Sacco does the same thing. He uses a cartoony style in order to mute the heaviness, and therefore to bring us closer to it for a longer duration, to ask us to unroll our windows and take in some of the pain. In Sacco's hands, comics illuminate the truth of perspective. His approach is not what is popularly termed fair and balanced, because his perspective does not sit in the middle of different viewpoints, happily sharing a little of each. Rather, it is located in faces. So he's not particularly interested in tracking down the ramifications behind the figures of Israeli justice during the settler trials. Those remain within the shadow of his illumination. Palestine is introduced by Edward Said. Said's book Orientalism is a major statement of post-colonial criticism, a critical perspective that attempts to understand and articulate how the individual is shaped by colonial history. Sacco's book includes, but is not about such a history. Aside from a brief lesson, a two-page splash on the 1917 Balfour Declaration, he has little time for history, and beyond a chapter-long discussion in Tel Aviv with Naomi and Paula, little time for an Israeli perspective. He is concerned with illustrating a perspective not popularly represented in Western media, certainly not in the early 1990s. He does this most effectively when he drops out of the scene altogether. For example, Ghassan's story in Moderate Pressure, Part 2. Make no mistake, everywhere you go, not just in Marvel Comics, there's parallel universes. Here, on the surface streets, traffic, couples in love, falafel to go, tourists in jogging suits licking stamps for postcards, and over the wall behind closed doors, other things. People strapped to chairs, sleep deprivation, the smell of piss, other things happening for reasons of national security, for security reasons, to combat terrorist activity. They were happening to Ghassan a week and a half ago. He shows me his back and wrists. He's still got the marks. He's a fresh case, all right, right off the rack. Now he's back in his middle-class living room in East Jerusalem, offering tea and goodies to a guest. 4 weeks ago, he was a suspect, arrested in the same sweep that got Mustafa Akawi. Remember him? That guy we just buried. Ghassan tells me his story, his kids climbing all over him. And soon his little girl is fast asleep. Probably she's too young to understand, or else she's heard it all before. In any case, she's asleep. And sleep is where Ghassan's story starts, where stories like this always start, when people are asleep. And then the door gets bashed down. The chapter begins with parallel universes. One, a world of middle-class apartments, falafels to go, and jogging suits. The other, behind closed doors, something else, something defined by issues of national security. Sacco's drawing initially makes Ghassan part of the first of these parallel universes, identifiable. Cartoony, surely, but just so, recognizable, a middle-class father with an elaborate rug and toys in the living room, who shows off his bruises and sits on the couch where his kids swarm all over him. The first panel is surrounded by prose. The strip at the bottom of the page focuses in on the younger daughter progressively as sleep falls upon her. This movement leads us out of the present and into the story proper, silently dropping Sacco out of the picture. In the next page, we see Ghassan as he emerges from his bedroom in a different time. The The police are crowded into Ghassan's home, big men in a small room. The trench-coated inspector casually fingers a family photo. Ghassan squints and is blindfolded. Accused of belonging to an illegal organization, he is shown a piece of paper. The third page moves the action from the house to the police station and formalizes the representation from the relatively open 3-panel page to a tighter 2x3 grid. Everyone at the station is fairly sleepy. The station men yawn and drink coffee. The officer cataloging Ghassan's belongings is on the verge of nodding off. At this point, we're still in the first universe, though we're mired in bureaucracy. From there, the situation becomes more serious and the panels shift to a 3x3 grid. It's at this point that the panels begin to seem too tight, too claustrophobic for comfort, and we realize that we're entering into the second universe. At the center of the page, hooded, Ghassan is no longer so identifiable. He's boxed in. We're tempted to roll up the window and stop reading. The grid work becomes progressively tighter as we turn the page, shifting first to a 3x4 grid and then to 2 pages of 4x4 grids, the first of which relate Ghassan's first 48 hours in captivity and the second which extends his custody another 48 hours. On the next page, Sacco shifts the grid to an almost unbearable 4x5 layout. Ghassan loses track of time and of reality. He thinks his daughter is dead before him, his brother is dead before him, that the bodies of his father and his uncle lie right there before him. Decompression is a technique we've seen before, of packing panels to create intense speed. This is something else, a decompression that packs in panels to disorient time, to make time seem to move quickly and slowly simultaneously, so that the page appears closed down as tight as Ghassan's cell. The time becomes indeterminate. With the turn of the page, we lose track of time, as does Ghassan, first thinking that 7 or 8 hours have passed, then 24 to 30. His hallucinations become worse. The pages and days pass. Finally, we realize it has been 19 days. And just like that, he is released. The effect is liberating. We can feel the fresh air and sunlight, but it's also surreal because the two realities are so different, barely of the same universe. Indeed, they seem parallel universes. All that tension does not touch the city street. The page creates reality through an unreal format. Reading it, we forget that the entire story is a retelling, that Sacco could not, of course, could not have seen the police in the house, could not have been in the cell or in the courtroom, could not have witnessed Ghassan's visions. When Sacco's character steps away from the media, when we lose his satiric filter and perceive the stories directly, the media of telling becomes invisible to us and the story becomes an objective story. Ghassan claims innocence throughout, and because Sacco takes him at his word, we must as well. As a result, the story is not about the weighing of the facts of the case so much as about considering the nature of administrative violence. That is, it is a story of what happens when security reasons overwhelm human perspective. Although in many ways the comic is a particular indictment of Israeli security policies, an indictment grounded in one particular perspective, its claim is both sobering and cautionary overall. For what Sacco argues is that reasons of national security create a world of parallel universes, a world in which certain perspectives become invisible. And what Sacco concludes is that this road leads nowhere. It gives no way out. At the very end of the book, in chapter 9, Sacco, ready to pull out himself, boards a bus. The bus, taking me away, left Israel and entered the Gaza Strip on its way to the Rafah border crossing. We carefully skirted Palestinian population centers, but it soon became apparent, and word spread, the driver was lost. He stopped at a Jewish settlement for directions, but a few minutes later, we were heading for what looked like a Palestinian refugee camp or town. You could see the kids in the distance taking cover on each side of the road. If we continued that way, we were going to get stoned. The driver backed the bus up and turned it around. He stopped at a small army post and asked for more directions. The bus comes to a crossroads. The driver asks directions and heads down a different road. Threatened by ambush, the driver, his worried face so recognizable, backs up and goes a different way and asks directions again. And then Palestine just ends. Sacco may have a ticket out. He may be ready to roll his windows up and bank his safe trip home. But here he recognizes, after drawing all those faces, after laying out and inking over 200 pages, that he has come to a dead end. That, at best, the situation is one of confusion and lost ways, and at worst has created an army of young fighters waiting in ambush behind dumpsters, rocks in hand. So instead of providing us with some tidy solution that balances out fairly national security against individual perspective, that moralizes the situation with a heavy hand, Palestine just ends because there seems no way out.